The moment I realized my family no longer saw me as someone to protect was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. Almost polite. My mother didn't raise her voice. My sister didn't shout. My father didn't argue. They simply looked at me, tired, fragile, standing there asking for a little patience, and decided I was inconvenient. That silence cut deeper than any accusation ever could. I had always believed love was steady. That family meant staying, even when things were messy or uncomfortable. I was the kind of person who softened my words before speaking, who apologized even when I wasn't wrong, who believed that if I stayed gentle long enough, everyone else would remember how to be kind. At least, that's who I was before that week. Everything had unraveled slowly. A string of losses, small and large, had piled up until my strength felt thin. I hadn't come to my family to ask for money or miracles. I came because I needed time. Space. A place where I could breathe without pretending I was okay. Instead, I was treated like a problem that needed solving. My sister was the first to say it out loud. Not cruelly, she smiled when she said it, like she was being practical. "You're always struggling," she said. "It's exhausting for everyone." Exhausting. As if my pain were a chore. My father nodded, avoiding my eyes. My mother folded her hands, already resigned. They spoke in calm tones, using words like boundaries and reality and what's best for the family. No one asked what was best for me. When I tried to explain how alone I felt, my voice shook. I hated that part, the way emotion made me sound weak. My sister sighed. My father checked his phone. That's when I understood, my feelings were not only unwelcome, they were an inconvenience. "You can't keep leaning on us," my mother said gently. "We've done all we can." That sentence echoed in my chest long after the conversation ended. I packed my things that night in silence. No one stopped me. No one offered to talk more tomorrow. My sister stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching like she was relieved it was finally over. As I closed the door behind me, something inside me fractured, not loudly, but completely. It wasn't anger yet. It was grief. The kind that comes when you realize the place you thought was home no longer exists. What none of them knew, what I hadn't told a single person, was that just hours earlier, my phone had vibrated with a message that changed everything. A message I hadn't even processed yet. I had read it twice, then put the phone face down, because it felt unreal. Heavy. Like something that didn't belong to me. I wasn't ready to talk about it. I wasn't ready to believe it. So I said nothing. That night, alone, I replayed every moment I had ever defended my family to myself. Every excuse I had made for them. Every time I had chosen understanding over self-respect. I realized I had mistaken endurance for loyalty, silence for peace. Lying awake, I felt something unfamiliar settle in me, not confidence, not power, but clarity. I understood then that love, when it comes with conditions, is not safety. And that being gentle does not mean allowing yourself to disappear. By morning, I was still the same person to them, the burden, the problem, the one who needed too much. But inside me, something had begun to change. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how quickly the truth would surface. All I knew was this: I would no longer explain my worth to people who benefited from doubting it. And for the first time, I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because I was listening to myself. The days after I left felt unreal, like I was watching my own life from a distance. I moved through hours quietly, answering emails, folding clothes, drinking tea that always went cold before I finished it. My phone stayed face down most of the time. Not because no one was calling, but because I didn't want to see how easy it was for them not to. When I finally checked, there were no messages asking if I was okay. Only practical ones. My mother reminding me to pick up the rest of my things. My sister asking when I'd be fully settled elsewhere. No warmth. No concern. Just efficiency. It was strange how quickly people rewrite you once they decide you're a burden. I replayed the last conversation again and again, searching for the moment where I could have saved myself. If I had spoken more calmly. If I had hidden my fear better. If I had asked for less. That was my habit, believing that if something hurt, it must be because I had handled it wrong. But in the silence that followed, a new understanding crept in. They hadn't pushed me away because I was too much. They had pushed me away because it was easier than facing their own discomfort. I kept my distance. Not as a strategy, but because I was tired. Tired of shrinking myself to fit into rooms where my presence felt like a problem. I focused on small routines instead, morning walks, deep breaths, writing thoughts I had never said out loud. It was in those quiet moments that the truth I carried began to settle in my body. The message from my grandfather's lawyer still sat unopened in my inbox. I knew what it said. Or at least, I knew enough. Control. Responsibility. A role I never imagined for myself. The weight of it pressed against my chest every time I thought about it. I didn't tell my family. Not out of spite. Not to surprise them. But because I needed to understand what it meant before anyone else could touch it. I had spent my life letting people define my value. This time, I wanted to decide who I would be before the world reacted. A few days later, my sister finally called. Her tone was light, almost cheerful. "We've been talking," she said. "About what happened." "We." Not me and her. Them. Always them. She explained that they hadn't meant to hurt me. That things were stressful. That I needed to learn independence. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they felt hollow. At the end of the call, she added casually, "We assume you'll figure things out." "You always do." I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. I always did. And they always took comfort in that without ever offering help. After the call, I sat in silence and finally allowed myself to feel it all. The betrayal. The loneliness. The slow realization that love, when measured by convenience, disappears the moment it costs something. But something else was growing beneath the hurt. Awareness. I began to notice patterns I had ignored for years. How my support was expected but rarely returned. How my struggles were minimized, while my strengths were quietly relied upon. How being the strong one had become my assigned role, even when I was breaking. That night, I opened the email again. I read every word carefully this time. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. Instead, I felt calm. Not excitement, clarity. This wasn't a weapon. It wasn't revenge. It was a responsibility. And it would change things, not because I would announce it, but because I would finally stop negotiating my place in other people's lives. I didn't reach out. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I let the silence do what words never could. Because sometimes, the loudest shift happens when you stop asking to be seen, and start choosing yourself instead. By the third week, the pain had softened into something quieter. Not gone, but steadier, like a bruise you stop flinching from because you've learned where it lives. I moved through my days with intention now. I listened more than I spoke. I watched carefully. And for the first time, I saw my family without the blur of hope clouding my vision. They began to circle back, not with apologies, but with curiosity. It started subtly. A text from my mother asking how I was managing. A message from my father reminding me to keep my documents organized. My sister sent a photo from a family gathering I hadn't been invited to, followed by a smiling emoji, as if inclusion could be simulated after the fact. None of them asked why I had gone quiet. They assumed silence meant surrender. What they didn't know was that while they were speculating, I was preparing. Not in secretive ways, just responsibly. Meetings. Paperwork. Long conversations with people who spoke calmly and clearly, who explained consequences instead of making me feel guilty. I learned quickly. Not because I wanted power, but because I had been handed something that required maturity. And maturity, I was discovering, looked a lot like restraint. There were moments when I wanted to tell them. To say, "You were wrong about me." To see their expressions change. To feel validated. But each time the urge rose, I asked myself why. Was it for closure, or to finally be acknowledged? The answer was uncomfortable. I had spent too long measuring my worth by their reactions. So I stayed quiet. The truth I carried began to change me from the inside out. I stood straighter. I stopped explaining my choices. I let calls go unanswered if they came with expectation instead of care. When my sister hinted that I should come by and talk things through, I simply said I was busy. It wasn't cruelty. It was boundaries, something I was learning for the first time. When we did meet again, it was brief and neutral. They spoke more than I did. They filled the silence with observations about how independent I seemed lately, how calm. My mother said it like a compliment. My sister said it like a question. I nodded. I didn't correct them. I noticed then how their confidence relied on my availability. How my distance unsettled them, not because they missed me, but because they no longer understood me. The version of me they knew had always been predictable. Reliable. Open. This one wasn't. The shift happened without an announcement. No confrontation. No dramatic reveal. Just a steady change in posture, tone, and presence. I was no longer seeking permission to exist. And they felt it. A few days later, my father asked directly, "Is there something we should know?" I met his eyes calmly. "No," I said. And it was the truth. There was nothing they needed to know. That night, alone again, I reflected on how power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as responsibility, patience, and the ability to walk away without proving a point. I realized then that what I had been given wasn't just control over assets or decisions, it was control over myself. Over my time. My emotional energy. My future. The betrayal still hurt. But it no longer defined me. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I was changing my expectations. And as the final pieces settled into place, I understood something essential. The moment you stop chasing respect is often the moment it finally arrives, just not from where you expected it. I didn't know how they would react when the truth surfaced. I didn't need to. Because by then, I would already be standing somewhere else, grounded, calm, and no longer asking to be chosen. The truth came out the way most important things do, without drama, without a stage, without me saying a word. It wasn't a confrontation or a confession. It was a formality. A series of quiet confirmations that reached my family through channels they respected far more than my emotions ever had. A phone call returned. A document reviewed. A meeting requested. By the time they understood the shift, it had already happened. And I wasn't there to watch it. I found out later, in fragments. My mother's voice softer than usual when she called. My father suddenly careful with his words. My sister, for the first time in her life, unsure of her footing. No one apologized outright. Instead, they spoke in the language they knew best, acknowledgement disguised as politeness. I didn't realize how much responsibility you were carrying, my father said. It wasn't the apology I once dreamed of. But it was honest enough. They asked if we could start fresh. If I could come by more often. If we could talk about the future together. I listened. And then I chose myself. I'm open to a relationship, I said calmly, but it has to look different than before. There was a pause on the line. Not anger. Not resistance. Just surprise. They had never heard me speak like that, clear, steady, without pleading. I didn't list grievances. I didn't explain the pain in detail. I didn't ask them to understand what they had never tried to before. I simply set the terms of my presence. I would not be available on demand. I would not accept dismissal disguised as honesty. I would not stay in rooms where my worth was questioned. They agreed, not enthusiastically, but sincerely. Because now, they understood something had shifted beyond negotiation. In the weeks that followed, our interactions changed. Conversations were shorter, more respectful. My sister no longer spoke over me. My mother asked instead of assuming. My father listened. Not because I had power over them, but because I had power over myself. And that changed everything. There were moments of sadness still. Grief for the version of family I once believed in. For the girl I had been, soft, hopeful, always trying to earn love that should have been freely given. But there was peace, too. A deep, steady peace that came from knowing I didn't abandon myself anymore. One evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea that stayed warm in my hands, I realized something quietly profound. I no longer needed them to see me clearly in order to see myself. The outcome wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was freedom. Freedom to choose where I invested my care. Freedom to build a life rooted in respect, not obligation. Freedom to love without losing myself. My family didn't collapse. They didn't suffer publicly. They simply adjusted to the natural consequences of how they had treated me. And I adjusted, too. I learned that boundaries are not walls. They are doors, with locks. I learned that silence can be strength when it's chosen. And I learned that dignity doesn't demand recognition, it lives quietly in the way you walk away from what no longer honors you. I didn't need to prove anything. I had already become someone I was proud of. And in the end, that was the power shift that mattered most.